Her parents traded her away, not for sin, not for scandal, but for the simple fact that her womb had failed to bloom. That alone made her worthless. So they sold her, unwanted and ashamed, until a solitary Comanche with 5 children of his own took notice. Cross Creek Border Market, Kansas Territory. Late autumn, 1874. Wind swept through the open square like a restless spirit, stirring dust into tight spirals that danced between worn boots and dragged across weather-beaten canvas stalls. The light of the setting sun hung low and heavy, casting a burnt-orange glow across the brittle landscape. In the heart of it all, tied cruelly to a rough-hewn post like a discarded sign or forgotten possession, stood Elelena Rose. Her father's voice sliced through the murmuring crowd. Each word weighted with disgust. She is barren. Folks, can't bear a child to save her life. But she sews, she cooks, and she don't talk back. Half the price of a breeding cow. Please, Papa, Elelena whispered, her voice brittle and thin against the whip of the wind. Her wrists throbbed where the rope gnawed at the skin, already rubbed raw. Her cheeks bore the scorch of sun and shame, streaked with tears now dried to salt. Shut your mouth, her father barked. You should be grateful I'm selling you in daylight, where men can look you in the face instead of feeding you to pigs. A few laughed. Others turned their eyes away, uncomfortable. Eleanor had once worn a veil and white dress at the altar of St. John's Chapel, hands shaking not from dread, but fragile hope. The dress was stitched by her mother's own hands. Her groom, the favored son of a wealthy cattle baron, had looked at her like a prize filly, valuable, if only for her bloodline. The marriage had been brokered as a blessing. She was told she had been chosen. For 2 long years she swallowed bitter roots from a wrinkled midwife's hand, counted her days on fingers gone pale from hope, and knelt in prayer until her knees ached raw. But her belly never swelled. Her blood came monthly, cruel and punctual. No infant's cry ever filled their home. Her mother-in-law was the first to speak, aloud what others only hinted. She's just decoration, a flower with no seed. Let's not waste spring on dry ground. Her husband began to look past her, then stopped looking altogether. One evening, without warning, he returned with a girl not yet 16, with bright eyes and a sour, knowing smile. He handed Elelena a letter and signed, stiff cold. She will give me sons, he said, eyes fixed elsewhere. You cannot. They packed her meager belongings and placed them by the door. She wasn't allowed to stay the night. The new girl had taken her place, her room, her chair at the table, even her pillow. Elelena walked 5 miles in the dark, her heart dragging like her feet, to the house of the man who had raised her. Her mother had long since passed. Her father opened the door, took one look at her empty hands and hollowed face, and sneered. You should have kept your womb working. That was your only job. He made her sleep in the barn. By morning, his mind was made up. There were mouths to feed, debts to settle. A daughter who could not birth sons was worth less than a sick mule, less than a bucket of spoiled milk. So now she stood, roped to the center post of the town market, like a cautionary tale. Her wedding dress, once white with possibility, now torn, dust-ridden, and stained with the proof of her disgrace. The rope at her wrist tugged and burned every time she shifted to keep her balance. Anyone? Her father shouted again, this time with an edge of impatience. She's 22, still got all her teeth, just broke on the inside. Laughter flickered from the crowd. A boy pointed. A woman clicked her tongue and turned away. Elelena stared blankly, her eyes dull and unfocused. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Grief had wrung her dry long before today. Her dignity had been peeled away slowly, layer by layer, first by her husband's indifference, then by her father's cruelty, and now in front of strangers who wouldn't spare a dollar but might haggle for chickens. The wind shifted. It brought with the stink of manure, rust, and dried hay. But Elelena smelled only ash. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang for supper. Somewhere else, another woman delivered a child. But not her, not ever her. And the world did not stop. It never does, not even when something inside you cracks. The laughter stuttered and died. The muttering of the crowd thinned, then vanished altogether. A stillness swept the square like a curtain drawn shut. Even the dust in the air seemed to freeze. It started with hooves. Slow, measured, too quiet for how many were coming. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A child dropped a stick of licorice. From the far edge of the market, they emerged like specters, riders, lean and marked with trail dust, stepping from between the trees. A small group of Comanche, their presence wordless but felt like a gust of wind before a storm. At the front rode a man who looked carved from earth and weather. His shoulders were wide, his chest bare beneath a worn deer-hide vest. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of red cloth. His face was stoic, carved by time and sun, bearing no anger, only weariness, deep-set and immovable. Behind him, 5 children followed on smaller ponies. The eldest, a boy of about 10, held his head high, though his eyes darted with the sharpness of survival. A girl around 8 rode beside him, face mostly hidden by a worn shawl. The younger 3 were dressed in mismatched clothes, dusty and patched. The littlest, no more than 3, clung to a corn husk doll, seated in front of her brother. The man dismounted. Dust clung to the bottom of his leggings. Still damp with creek mud, he moved without pause toward the table where Ella Laner's father stood, arms crossed, mouth pressed tight, eyes narrow with suspicion. Ella Laner blinked. Her lips were cracked, her vision hazy. But through the blur, she saw the man coming. This stranger, silent as dusk, surrounded by children and mystery. Something inside her shifted, not quite hope, but the first faint stir of something not empty. The man reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he drew a silver necklace, simple, handmade, unpolished. On the back, a name was carved with care. Niva. I will take her, he said, his voice low, rough like cedar and smoke. Not as a wife, as a soul that should not be chained. Her father scoffed. What if she's no good for you either? Want a refund? Later the man did not flinch. His gaze moved to Ella Laner for the first time and held. And in that silence, something began. Not her body, not her age, not her shame, just her, as if, in one glance, this man had seen something no one else had ever bothered to look for. Something beyond usefulness, beyond failure. He didn't see a woman broken by rejection. He saw a soul still breathing. She is not a thing, he said, voice calm but firm, as if the idea of owning another human insulted the earth itself. I do not buy to own. I buy to free. Her father hesitated. For a moment, pride and greed warred in his expression. Then his eyes fell on the silver necklace, the name, the weight, the promise of trade, and that old hunger won. His fingers hovered, then snatched it from the table, like a gambler taking his last coin. You're a problem now, he muttered. No one else moved. The entire market square seemed to hold its breath. Ella Laner's throat constricted, and her knees bent under her. The rope cut away, but she barely felt it, her limbs too used to stillness, her muscles slow to believe she could move freely again. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes found the place where the necklace had rested in the dust. Then they lifted, drawn to the stranger's back, broad and solid beneath the fading sun. As he turned and walked away without another word, the 5 children waited behind him, silent as ghosts, fragments of a life she couldn't imagine belonging to. And then she stepped forward, not because she trusted him, not because she believed in mercy or second chances, but because, for the first time in months, someone had looked at her and seen someone, not something. Her father didn't speak as she passed. The crowd had already begun to drift away, their curiosity spent, their attention shifting like crows to a new noise. Barefoot and bruised, Ella Laner walked from the square, not dragged, not carried, walking on her own 2 feet toward the edge of a world she no longer knew. The journey that followed was long and silent, the kind of silence that settles into the bones like a slow ache. Ella Laner rode stiffly in the back of a mule cart, wooden slats pressing hard against her spine with every jolt in the road. Her hands remained clasped in her lap, knuckles white, as though letting go might make her vanish. The children rode behind on small ponies, quiet, their eyes large and unreadable. No one laughed. No one cried. They just watched. The sun dipped behind the distant ridge as they neared the forest, casting a rose-colored smear across the trees. Tall pines rose around them like ancient witnesses. A creek whispered nearby, threading through rock and moss with soft determination. The land felt different here. Not soft, but steady. Not cruel, but unyielding in its truth. He led her through a clearing where a single lodge stood, made of pine logs and stretched hide, patched with care and age. Smoke curled thinly from a narrow chimney. A wind shine of bone and beads turned lazily above the entrance, whispering in a breeze like a language she couldn't yet understand. This was her space, he said, nodding toward the door. He didn't say who her was. He didn't need to. Ella Laner stepped inside and halted. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and ash, with a faint hint of lavender that clung to the fabric of the place. The room was spare but not empty. A cot rested in the corner. A fire pit, still glowing faintly. A rolled sleeping mat. No mirrors, no lace, no vanity. But the walls were covered in etchings, symbols and carvings that told stories from hands not her own. Outside, 5 children lingered just beyond the threshold. The eldest boy stood with arms crossed. The next child, a boy just younger, glanced at her once and looked away. The girl beside him clutched his sleeve tightly. The youngest twins, barely past toddlerhood, huddled together, wary, wide-eyed. The man, too, she'd come to know, knelt beside the hearth and added a log. "This is Ella Laner," he said, as if that alone explained everything. "She stays here now." He looked at the children, not asking permission, not making a case, simply stating what was. Then he stood and walked away. Ella Laner sat on the cot, unsure whether to lie down or stand, speak, or be still. No orders were given, no expectations voiced. She sat in the quiet, listening, the shifting of feet, the creak of timbers, a faint giggle, an owl's call echoing in the dark. Her hands throbbed with unused motion. She stared at the pale line on her ring finger, almost gone now. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by dreams of closing doors and voices raised in rooms she could no longer enter. By the third night, she couldn't stay still. The fire was low, casting long shadows that flickered along the walls. The children lay near the hearth, curled like nesting animals, wrapped in each other's warmth. She rose without thinking, driven by the ache of idleness. She sorted dried beans. She drew water from the well. She lit a new fire with hands that had once prepared feasts, stitched wedding gowns, nursed bruises. Not for praise, not for anyone, just to feel useful, just to remind herself she existed. Then came the cough, sharp, wet, cutting the stillness like a blade. The youngest boy lay curled, his tiny body hot with fever, his breathing shallow and strained. She crossed the room in an instant, knelt beside him, felt the heat burning off his skin like a warning. Her chest tightened. No one else stirred. The others slept on, unaware. She stood and moved quickly now, searching shelves, lifting hides, pushing aside bundles. A cracked wooden bowl, a sprig of dried herbs, a bundle wrapped in old hide string. Her hands trembled, but she moved as if she'd done before. She did not know their names, but she had used herbs like these before. Her fingers crushed the brittle leaves, added water, and set the pot over the fire. The boil took too long. Her hands trembled with each stir. When it finally cooled, she spooned the bitter mix to the boy's lips. He coughed but drank. She wiped his damp brow with a cloth, never stopping, not once. Her hands needed something to do, something to keep fear from settling in. Outside, something shifted, a soft rustle, then silence. At the threshold, resting gently against the worn wood, lay a sprig of green, bound with horsehair. Ta hadn't spoken, but he had seen, and this was his answer. No praise, no instruction, just the offering. By dawn, the fever had broken. The boy blinked awake, his small eyes searching the dark before slipping closed again in sleep. Later, the other children watched her differently, not with full trust, not yet, but with something else, a quiet awareness, the first bloom of belief. And for now, that was enough. The days began to settle into rhythm. Not soft, but steady. Ella Laner rose with the sun, stoking the fire before the cold left the air. She swept the lodge with a branch broom, collected herbs near the tree line, and boiled corn until the smell reminded her of church mornings, of a life so distant it felt imagined. The children rarely spoke, but they watched everything. At first, from behind corners, then from doorways, then from just behind her shoulder. Ella Laner, unsure how to speak softness when her own voice still felt like a bruise, turned instead to action. Steady hands, small kindnesses. She braided the girl's hair when it tangled beyond her reach. She mended a rip in the older boy's tunic. She left red berries beside the twins' bedding, sour on their own, but sweetened when dipped in honey. One afternoon, while gathering willow bark near the creek, she showed the 6-year-old how to fold wide leaves into boats. The girl furrowed her brow in fierce concentration, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she copied Eleanor's movements. When the boat floated gently down the stream and the girl smiled, truly smiled, Ella Laner felt something loosen in her chest, something deep and sore and still, somehow, alive. They began to follow her more after that. She told them stories, not grand epics, but the ones her mother had passed down. Talking animals, stars that fell in love with the moon, a fox that stole a wedding dress. The younger children leaned close, wide-eyed. The oldest pretended not to listen. But once, after dark, she heard him whispering one of her tales to the goats. To did not interfere. He came and went like the wind, sometimes with roots or dried meat, sometimes with nothing but silence. He never touched her, never asked anything, but he always nodded as he passed. And sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she saw a hint of a smile behind his worn eyes. She didn't know if that made things better or worse. She'd meant well. The fire had burned too hot, the pot too full. A careless bump of her hip, and it all crashed, the broth, the soft beans, the tender roots, spilling across the lodge floor. Ella Laner stood above the mess, heart pounding, muscles locked. She could already feel it. The slap, the shame, the sharp voice shouting her worth down to ash. Her hands shook, her knees bent. The old fear rushed back in. Tojo's voice came from behind, calm, even. She turned. He was already kneeling, scooping vegetables back into the pot with steady hands. "It can be made again," he said, wiping his fingers on a cloth. "We all spill. No blame, no flinch, just presence." Ella Laner dropped to her knees beside him, helped clean in silence, blinking fast. She did not cry. Not then, not until later, when the lodge had gone quiet, and the children lay curled in their sleep. She sat by the hearth, the scent of beans still lingering, and thought of her wedding day, of her mother-in-law's mouth curled in contempt, of the many times she'd said sorry for being less than what was wanted, and she thought of 5 pairs of eyes that had watched her, not with judgment, but with something else. That night, the youngest twin stirred with a cough. Ella Laner woke, reached for the damp cloth near the fire, and padded barefoot to the sleeping pile. She placed a hand to the child's brow. Warm, but nothing alarming, just a passing chill. And as the child settled back to sleep, Ella Laner stayed there a little longer, listening to the quiet breathing around her. Not needed, not commanded. She tucked the quilt in tighter around the boy's small frame, her fingers gentle, practiced. A quiet hum rose from her throat, low, rhythmic. A melody meant more for herself than anyone else. The boy stirred, murmuring something in Comanche, the syllables soft, muddled with sleep. Eleanor leaned closer, her ear near his mouth. "What was that, sweetheart?" she asked, voice tender. He didn't answer at first, only reached up with his tiny hand and patted hers with the kind of trust that broke something inside her. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Aina." The word fell heavy between them, like a stone sinking into a still pond. Aina. She had heard that word before, shared between siblings when their mother was near, spoken in lullabies whispered in twilight. It didn't mean nursemaid. It didn't mean helper or stranger. It meant mother, a name of blood and bone, not borrowed duty. Eleanor felt her breath hitch, caught high in her chest. She sat motionless for a long time. The child's hand curled around hers like a promise. Her other hand hovered near her heart, tried to steady the tremor beneath her ribs. She wasn't their kin. She had no claim to their lineage. But in that moment, with that word, she became something more, something rooted, real. She bent low, pressed a kiss to the boy's brow, and slowly sat upright, taking in the room around her. The girl with the tangled braid lay still, breath soft. The middle child, always snoring like a saw through a log, shifted in his sleep. The eldest, serious, watchful, slept facing the doors always. Each of them dreamed beneath layers of wool and hide. Not one had come from her body, but all of them had grown beneath her hands, under her care. She had sewn their shirts, wiped their noses, soothed their fevers. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Inside, her heart whispered back in its own quiet language. By the time to tied his horse to the hitch rail, the sun was already high over the trading post, beating down hard on the dry earth. The air buzzed with heat, flies, and the bartering voices of market day. They needed things: salt, flour, fresh bandages. He didn't tell her to come. He had simply asked, as he always did, and Eleanor had said yes. They walked side by side, close but never touching, down the main path lined with stalls and voices. She wore a simple brown dress, her braid hidden beneath a scarf, and carried the woven basket Tojo had made her. It swayed gently from her elbow with each step. The noise of the market didn't overwhelm her as it once had. She didn't feel safe, exactly, but she felt anchored, more herself than she had in months. Children darted past them with sticks, laughing, shrieking. Women bartered sharply over spices and tobacco. The scent of tanned hides and frying lard drifted on the breeze. She allowed herself to relax, until a voice sliced through the noise like a blade. Eleanor turned, slow and deliberate. Standing near the dry goods stall beneath a frilly parasol was her former mother-in-law, wrapped tight in expensive lace and old grudges. Beside her stood a younger woman dressed in pale blue, her belly just beginning to swell with child. Her gloves rested atop it with curated delicacy. The older woman stepped forward, her voice dripping disdain. I thought I recognized that hunched little neck. Mabel. No, Eleanor. She clicked her tongue, hard to tell with all the dirt and homespun. The younger one giggled, her gaze lingering on Eleanor's patched dress, calloused hands, and simple basket. That's her? She asked, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. The one who couldn't even manage a pup, let alone a baby? Yes, the elder snapped. Pretty but cursed. About as useful as a crack jar. We gave her everything, and she gave us nothing. The words hit like stones. Eleanor's throat burned, her feet locked in place. Around her, heads turned, traders, townsfolk, men spitting tobacco and women holding jars. The whispers stung worse than nettles. Still, she stood tall, clutching her basket with white-knuckled hands. She would not cry. She had shed all the tears she could afford. Then a quiet shift, a shadow beside her. His sleeves were rolled, stained with earth. Mud still clung to his boots from the river crossing. He didn't speak right away, just stood solidly beside her, silent but undeniable. And then, with a voice calm and clear as spring water, he said, She is the only one who made my daughter smile after her mother died. The square fell still. Eleanor's breath caught mid-chest. His gaze didn't waver. She holds fevered children through the night, he said. She hums lullabies she wasn't born knowing. She remembers birthdays no one told her. That's more than sons born from a woman's belly, but never her heart. Neither woman answered. The older's cheeks turned crimson. The younger shrank behind her parasol, to lean toward Eleanor and touched her elbow. Gently, not to drag her away, but to ask with soft pressure if she was ready to leave. She nodded, unable to speak. They walked through the market, without another word. No one followed. No one dared. At the edge of the woods, where pine needles muffled their steps and the wind smelled like clean rain, Eleanor stopped. Her hands trembled. She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she whispered. To said nothing. He only looked at her, deeply, steadily, and nodded once. That night, when the fire flickered low and the lodge was quiet with the slow breathing of sleeping children, Eleanor sat alone outside. In her lap lay a small wildflower she'd picked by the stream. She didn't know its name, only that it was yellow, stubborn, and had grown where nothing was supposed to. She twirled it gently between her fingers. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from pain or humiliation, but from something else entirely, from the fierce ache of being seen, from the quiet wonder of being defended, from the realization that someone had chosen her, not out of duty, but because they truly believed she was worth the choosing. The next morning, the wind carried the scent of pine and approaching rain. And then they came. 3 riders on horses, their boots clean, rifles polished, shoulders stiff with authority. One wore a red kerchief at his neck, the same her father had worn the day he tied her wrist to the market post. Behind them, trailing slightly, came a 4th man,